Michelle Fields, and I'm joined today by Tom Rogan, who is a writer and contributor at the National Review. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
So explain to us what is the current state of the whole Ukraine crisis.
Right. Well, at the moment, the Russians have essentially annexed Crimea. Had the referendum. A lot of Russian military forces now massing in Crimea. Yesterday, Ukrainian forces were essentially pushed out. I think the Ukrainian General Staff have given an order to the remaining Ukrainian forces to leave today. The big question, I think, at the moment for the international community, certainly for the United States, the US intelligence community, is what will the Russians do next? There are a lot of Russian forces massed on the eastern border of Ukraine, north of Crimea. And the big question is whether they're going to push into Ukraine proper and take more territory.
What should the U.S.'s response be? I mean, we have sanctions. Are the sanctions working? Is it enough?
I think it's pretty clear at the moment that the sanctions aren't working. You see the Russian government's reaction almost humorous in terms of their attitude. They do genuinely seem to find it funny. Right, which is a problem in the sense that if you are trying to create a change in the political dynamic, to be laughed at doesn't suggest a particularly conducive environment for that. So I think, the question is, how important is Ukraine to the United States, to the international community? And quite frankly, in my own opinion, if you were really serious about at least preventing the Russians from moving into eastern Ukraine, there has to be either much tougher sanctions, state-level sanctions, instead of focusing simply on individuals, really isolating the Russian government from trade, especially on the international scene. But also, I've suggested this to some criticism, I have to be honest, actually putting some American forces on the periphery, at least, of Ukraine, and potentially sending some forces into Kiev as a symbol. And, people say, well, you can't do that because it'll be... Well, look at what we did in the Cold War. Forces, a very limited amount of forces in Berlin. Look at South Korea, where 28,000 American forces are standing off against 1 million North Koreans. In each of those cases, had the Russians or the North Koreans decided to invade, that would have been a difficult dynamic for our troops. But we're making a stand, and people have, in both cases that worked because people knew that the United States was serious about standing up for our values, and that if it ever came to war, they would lose. And it would be the same with Russia. But again,
I think the problem is Americans don't want to get into a war. They don't want to see military there. They're exhausted.
They are.
But what do we know what's going on in Putin's mind? It seems as if Washington has no idea how to react, what to expect from him.
I think that, and that's a fantastic question. I think one of the great understated elements of this is how absent the US understanding is of Putin, of his inner circle. I think that speaks to a couple of things. Number one, pretty obviously it speaks to an intelligence deficit in Russia. I think you've seen since 9/11 a lot of CIA resources, for example, being moved into counterterrorism, to the neglect of other issues like Russia. But I think also looking at Putin's psychology, it's pretty clear from his own statements that what he wants is to consolidate a new Russia that has these frontier states, the old Soviet states, as a buffer against Western influence, against European power, and really to try and build a Russia that is proud again. You see United Russia, Putin's party, a huge vein of nationalism flowing through that. And again, the concern is, at least from my perspective, that if you don't draw a line, where does this end? Does it, Moldova, Eastern Europe further? It's a troubling dynamic.
He used his justification for going into Crimea was that there were lots of Russians there. Russians were threatened. The culture was threatened. That to me seems very scary because could he then use that excuse to go into other areas where there is a large Russian population and use that same justification?
I think you're absolutely right. Again, we're seeing now with the eastern areas of Moldova a lot of talk about, the Russians could go in there because there is a pretty sympathetic population towards Russia. And again, it provides him an angle. You certainly see in eastern Ukraine Russian-sponsored militias, sponsored by the GRU and SVR, the Russian intelligence services, trying to instigate problems. And I think, again, when you look at it from a sort of outside point of view, the kind of forces that the Russians have mobilized across eastern Ukraine, or on the perimeter of eastern Ukraine, are combined arms. They're supporting elements, aircraft, tanks, airborne troops. That speaks to, I think, the fact that the Russians may be looking to create an incident where they say, we have to go in, whether it is eastern Ukraine, again, or other states, to try and protect their troops, a pretense. So, troubling.
So you had this piece that you recently wrote arguing that Ukraine vindicates the NSA.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Okay.
Explain.
Well, so first let me give a hedge. I have a British accent, but I am American, so I was speaking somewhat from an American point of view. My main argument with that was actually that you look at the European reaction to what Putin has done, and it's incredibly timid, in the sense that the Germans especially have very deep energy relationships with Gazprom, the Russian energy supplier, but also, for example, the UK, where I spent a long time. The influence of Russian finance in London is huge. So a lot of these European states like to talk a lot about being standing up for democracy, but under the surface, I would actually call it corruption. There is a huge vein of sympathy in the establishment, financially, politically, and even in journalism to some degree, for Russia's influence in Europe, and that is creating dynamics that personally I think are not conducive to the national security interests of the United States. And so you have an NSA essentially in Ukraine, I think, showing, whether it's Russia or the Europeans, that actually states act in their own interest, and that you do need, at least in a foreign sense, we have the domestic debate, of course, of Rand Paul, etc., but at least in the foreign sense, you do need aggressive collection, because if you do not have that, then you have, again, another pretense in the sense of something that pretends to be going on, which actually under the surface is not going on.
Do you think that this was a failure of the intelligence community? Partially, I mean, it seemed as if we were blindsided by this.
Well, again, I think it was to some degree inevitably intelligence. It's an incredibly difficult game. I think sometimes we have this idealized notion that, with technology, we see this again with the, MH370 at the moment.
You think we have all the answers.
Supremacy, and that's again, even looking at Iraq, Iraqis couldn't understand in the aftermath of the war that why isn't the electricity back on? And, power, though, especially in an intelligence sense, is dealing with probabilities, dealing with difficult information. I think, yes, there was an intelligence failure. That's to some degree inevitable. But I think what we need to have is actually more resources focused on state collection, level collection, again, Russia, China, as well as obviously the counterterrorism imperatives, because you see what's happening here. Deficit of knowledge, a deficit of understanding, and quite frankly, I would say also a deficit of leadership, but that's a different issue. So.
Well, we will be covering the story as it continues. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us about it.
Thank you, Michelle.
For Next Generation TV, I'm Michelle Field. Thank you so much for watching.